Hello, government students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 5, Section 4, Congressional Committees. So, we're going to talk a little bit about some different types of committees and some of the responsibilities of each of these committees. There's what we call a standing committee. Standing committee is a committee that is always going to be there in either the House or the Senate, and they typically deal with large issues that affect our nation. So, that could be things like the defense, or it could be economic or transportation issues, or it could be agricultural issues. These are things that are just always going to be a need of the nation, and hence we need a committee that's going to be permanent. Subcommittee is usually a breakdown, kind of a subcategory of the standing committee. So, an example of a standing committee is education. Okay. And within the field of education, you have basically primary education or secondary education. Okay. The education that you might have K through 12. And then you have basically your college levels. And so, there may be different committees that deal with the college side of things and basically the primary and secondary side of education. That way they can kind of meet the needs that each have, which are kind of different than one another. Select committees. These are committees that study specific issues and they report their findings either to the House or the Senate. Select committees come up whenever there's certain needs for our nation. They may not necessarily always be around whenever we need them, but they arise when there's a need. Joint committees, these are committees that are made up of both the House and the Senate. And a lot of times they act as a study group that reports their findings to both the House and the Senate. So when we talk about events like 9/11, there was a joint committee that basically was looking at what happened that day, and they reported back to the House and the Senate the details that their hearings kind of brought up. Okay, you can have a conference committee. This is a committee that kind of arises whenever we have a bill that's gone through both the House and the Senate, and it's slightly different. Okay, meaning that maybe members of the House added certain amendments and members of the Senate added some different wording. And what the conference committee is going to do, it's going to try to resolve the differences so they can get one bill that they can send to the president to sign. Okay. Um, Kinds of committees I mentioned before, standing committees, these are permanent. You find them in both the House and the Senate. Your select committees, these are temporary. They typically study an issue. Both the House and the Senate create their own select committees. We mentioned conference committees. These are temporary. They resolve differences between different versions of bills that are passed in each house. They're made up of members of both the House and the Senate in a joint committee. Again, it is temporary or permanent, depending, and they act as a study group on certain topics. And again, it's made of members of both the House and the Senate. All right. So what's the purpose of committees in the House and the Senate? Committees, for the most part, allow members of Congress to divide their work into smaller groups. And this is just so that we can deal with the issues that our nation is facing. As our nation has, kind of evolved and gotten as big as it is, there's different issues and concerns that the nation has throughout the nation. So, um, what was the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 and how did it improve committee work? Basically, before this period of time, we had a situation where there were some questions about the authority of the committee chairperson. So the power of the committee chairperson had grown to the extent that committee work was being unnecessarily delayed because that chairperson was kind of getting into hoarding some of their power. What basically happens is that this act limited the power of the committee chairperson. And that makes it, I guess, in a way, a little easier to kind of get legislation through, and it's not going to be so biased. The seniority system, this basically is talking about the fact that members of the majority party with the most years of experience on a committee usually is selected as a chairperson. Though if an individual has been in the role of a chairperson for a long time, that can also be an issue. and hence there have been some changes. And this is where number 4 comes in. How has this changed since 71? Republicans began electing committee chairpersons by secret ballot. And in 1995, they basically put a term limit on a committee chairperson. So if they've served 3 terms in Congress, basically, then you have to put a new person into the chair position. It's just to make things fair. All right. Just taking a look at House of Representatives. We mentioned before that Nebraska has basically 3 members of Congress. If you look at the gray area, that is the first congressional district. So if you live in Platte and Madison County, that's kind of our little legislative district that we live in. You have the second district, which is Douglas and Sarpy counties, or part of Sarpy County. And then you have the third district, which is the rest of the state. And some of that is a great concern, especially now where we're in a year where we're taking a census. There was a guy named Jerry who was from the state of Massachusetts, who was known for designing legislative districts to fit his political needs. And the term called gerrymandering kind of comes up with this idea that you're drawing political legislative districts in order to help a political party gain a majority. And that's something that we have to be very concerned about, especially in this day and age when we talk about people having fair say in Congress and a fair say in politics. So, needless to say, that's something that is always a concern whenever we introduce redistricting. All right. Thank you very much.